I thought I knew everything about my marriage, until I found myself drawn to the one person I never imagined, my father-in-law. It wasn't planned, and it certainly wasn't right, but the way he looked at me that night at dinner shook something deep inside me. I told myself it was nothing, until it wasn't. What happened next turned my world upside down, and left me questioning everything I believed. Alex and I had what many would call the perfect marriage. Or so it seemed. We were the couple everyone envied. Young, ambitious, and deeply in love. At least, that's what I told myself for years. But over time, the spark that once lit up our lives began to fade. It wasn't one big event that caused it. It was the quiet erosion of passion, buried under late work hours, muted conversations, and the relentless grind of everyday life. Alex was a good man, a hard worker who provided for us in every way imaginable. But somewhere along the way, his focus shifted, more on his career, less on us. Our once thrilling connection now felt more like a quiet partnership. He was always distracted, his phone in hand, juggling endless meetings. And though I understood his drive, it left me feeling invisible, a shadow in my own home. And then there was Edward, Alex's father. Edward was the opposite of Alex in so many ways. Where Alex was cautious, Edward exuded effortless confidence. He carried himself with a charm that was hard to ignore, a warmth that made you feel seen. With his silver hair and knowing smile, he had a way of drawing people in. He often joined us for family dinners, ordinary evenings filled with laughter and memories. I never thought much of him beyond his role as Alex's father. But one evening, something changed. It was a simple dinner, one we'd hosted countless times before. The house smelled of roasted chicken and freshly baked pie, and Alex, as usual, was in and out of the dining room, distracted by work. Edward stayed behind, offering to help me clean up. His compliments about the meal seemed harmless at first, but his words lingered in a way that unsettled me. "You're good for Alex," he said, his gaze steady. "He's lucky to have someone like you." I dismissed the flutters in my chest, chalking it up to the wine or the warmth of the evening. But as the days went on, I couldn't ignore the way he'd looked at me or the electricity that seemed to hum in the air when we spoke. I didn't know it then, but that moment would change everything. After that evening, I couldn't stop replaying the conversation with Edward in my mind. The compliments, the way his eyes held mine for just a moment too long, it had all felt so innocent in the moment, yet something about it lingered. I told myself it was nothing, a silly thought that would pass. But deep down I knew it wasn't. Something had shifted, and I couldn't ignore it. The days that followed were uneventful on the surface. Alex buried himself in work, as usual, leaving me to handle the mundane routines of our life. But my thoughts were elsewhere. Every time I walked into the kitchen, I could still hear Edward's voice in my head, feel the weight of his presence beside me. I hated myself for it, for the way my heart raced when I thought of him. I told myself it was ridiculous. He was my father-in-law, for God's sake. But the harder I tried to push the thoughts away, the stronger they became. Edward's texts began innocently enough. A polite thank you for dinner. A comment about the wine I'd served. But then they started to feel different. He'd ask about my day, about how I was holding up with Alex being so busy. His messages were always kind, thoughtful, even encouraging, but there was an undercurrent to them, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. I told myself I was imagining it, reading too much into harmless pleasantries. And yet, when I saw his name pop up on my phone, my stomach would twist in anticipation. Alex remained oblivious to the growing tension inside me. He was so caught up in his work that he barely noticed the shifts in my mood, the way I lingered a little longer over my phone, or how I seemed distracted during our conversations. I hated him for that, for not seeing me, for not realizing that I was slipping away. One afternoon, while Alex was out on a business call, Edward texted me again. "If you're free, I'd love to grab a coffee with you sometime. There's so much more I'd like to learn about you." I stared at the message for what felt like an eternity, my heart pounding in my chest. I knew what it looked like, what it could lead to. I told myself to ignore it, to delete the message and pretend it never happened. But instead, I found myself typing out a response. "Sure. Let me know when works for you." The cafe was small and tucked away, a quiet place I'd never been before. When I walked in, Edward was already seated, a cup of espresso in front of him. He stood when he saw me, pulling out a chair for me with that same easy confidence that made him so magnetic. "Thanks for meeting me," he said, his smile warm and disarming. "I was starting to think you'd changed your mind." I laughed nervously, unsure of what I was doing there. We talked about the usual things, work, family, hobbies. But as the minutes passed, the conversation took a more personal turn. Edward asked questions Alex hadn't asked me in years. What made me happy? What did I dream about? What did I miss most about my younger self? The way he listened, the way his eyes held mine, made me feel like the only person in the world. It was intoxicating and terrifying all at once. When we parted ways that afternoon, I told myself it had been innocent, a friendly meeting, nothing more. But the truth was, I couldn't stop thinking about the way he'd looked at me, the warmth in his voice when he'd said, "You deserve to feel alive, to be seen." And for the first time in years, I felt like someone had really seen me. After that meeting at the cafe, everything changed. It wasn't immediate, but there was a shift I couldn't deny. Edward's words echoed in my mind. You deserve to feel alive, to be seen. I didn't want to admit how deeply they resonated, how they uncovered a part of me I thought I'd buried long ago. Every interaction with Edward from that point on felt charged, like there was an invisible thread pulling us closer, no matter how hard I tried to resist it. The next time we saw each other was at another family dinner. The air was filled with the usual laughter and conversation, but I was hyper-aware of Edward's presence. I felt his gaze on me when I moved around the kitchen, the way his hand brushed mine when he passed me a plate. Each moment was fleeting, but they built upon one another, layering tension like a taut string ready to snap. Alex, as always, was preoccupied. He barely looked up from his phone during dinner, leaving Edward and me to carry most of the conversation. Edward's compliments were subtle but personal. Comments about how I'd outdone myself with the meal, how my laugh was infectious. They seemed harmless to anyone else, but to me, they were anything but. Every word felt like a confession, a door left slightly ajar, daring me to step through. After dinner, Alex disappeared into his office, and I found myself alone with Edward again. This time, the silence between us was different, heavier, more deliberate. I busied myself with the dishes, hoping the clinking of plates would drown out the pounding of my heart. But when Edward stepped closer, leaning against the counter beside me, I knew there was no escaping the moment. "You work so hard to hold everything together," he said softly. "I hope Alex knows how lucky he is." I laughed, a brittle sound that betrayed the storm inside me. "He's busy. I get it. But do you?" Edward pressed, his voice laced with a quiet intensity. "Do you really feel seen, appreciated?" I froze, my hands submerged in soapy water. No one had ever asked me that. Not Alex, not anyone. I felt the weight of Edward's gaze, and when I turned to face him, the rawness in his eyes mirrored something I couldn't bring myself to name. "I don't know," I whispered. "I don't know if I even remember what that feels like." Edward stepped closer, his hand brushing mine under the guise of helping with the dishes. The touch was fleeting, but it sent a jolt through me, an electric charge that left me breathless. My instincts screamed at me to step back, to draw the line before it blurred any further. But I couldn't. I didn't want to. When he reached out to tuck a strand of hair behind my ear, I didn't move away. His fingers lingered, tracing the line of my jaw with a tenderness that made my chest tighten. The world seemed to fall away, leaving just the two of us in the quiet, dimly lit kitchen. "This is wrong," I whispered, my voice trembling. "I know," he replied, his voice barely audible. "But that doesn't make it any less real." His words hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. And then, before I could second-guess myself, he leaned in. The kiss was soft, tentative, as if he was giving me every chance to pull away. But I didn't. Instead, I leaned into him, letting the floodgates open as years of loneliness and longing came crashing down. The kiss deepened, his hands finding my waist and pulling me closer. My fingers tangled in his hair, my body moving of its own accord. It wasn't just passion. It was something deeper, something that felt like rediscovering a part of myself I'd long forgotten. For the first time in years, I felt alive. When we finally pulled apart, the reality of what we'd done hit me like a tidal wave. I stepped back, my breathing ragged, my heart pounding in my chest. "We can't do this," I said, though my voice lacked conviction. Edward nodded, his expression conflicted. "I know, but I don't regret it." Neither did I, and that terrified me. In the days that followed, I tried to carry on as if nothing had happened. But every glance, every fleeting touch when Edward and I crossed paths, reignited the fire we'd ignited in that kitchen. It was like an invisible barrier had been broken, and there was no going back. Edward texted me again a few days later. This time, there were no pleasantries, no pretense. His message was simple: "I can't stop thinking about you." My response was just as simple: "Me too." The next time we met, it was at his house. I told myself it was just to talk, to figure out how to stop the madness before it spiraled out of control. But the moment I stepped through the door, I knew there was no turning back. The pull between us was too strong, too undeniable. And when he kissed me again, this time with more urgency, I didn't stop him. I didn't want to. I told myself I could control it, that it was just a fleeting moment of weakness. But when I walked into Edward's house that evening, every shred of resolve I thought I had dissolved. The air was thick with unspoken words as he opened the door, his expression soft yet serious. The moment our eyes met, I knew I wasn't there to say goodbye. The house felt different that night, quieter, more intimate. Edward's cologne lingered in the air, warm and comforting, yet it made my pulse quicken. He led me to the living room, where a single lamp bathed the room in a golden glow. We sat down, a careful distance between us, but the space felt charged, as if every movement threatened to set something in motion we couldn't stop. "I wasn't sure you'd come," he said, his voice low. "Neither was I admitted, my hands twisting in my lap. We sat in silence for a moment, the weight of everything unsaid pressing down on us. Finally, Edward leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees as he looked at me. "This isn't easy for me either," he said. "I never meant for this to happen, but I can't ignore how I feel." His words cut through me, sharp and undeniable. I wanted to argue, to tell him he was wrong, but I couldn't. Because the truth was, I felt it too. That pull, that connection, it was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. And no matter how much I tried to fight it, it kept drawing me back to him. "I don't know what to do," I whispered. "This feels impossible." "Maybe it is," Edward said, his voice soft. "But that doesn't change what's happening between us." Before I could respond, he reached out, his hand covering mine. The touch was gentle, reassuring, yet it sent a shiver down my spine. I looked down at our intertwined fingers, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure he could hear it. "We can stop," he said, his voice trembling slightly. "Right now, if that's what you want." But that wasn't what I wanted, and we both knew it. Instead of pulling away, I leaned in, closing the distance between us. When our lips met, it was as if the world fell away. The kiss was slow, deliberate, filled with a longing that had been building for weeks. His hands cupped my face, his touch so gentle it made my chest ache. It wasn't just about desire, it was about feeling seen, feeling understood in a way I hadn't in years. And for the first time, I let myself give in to it completely. What happened next felt inevitable, like a dam breaking after holding back a flood for too long. Every kiss, every touch felt like a revelation, a piece of myself I'd been missing for so long. Edward's hands moved with a reverence that left me breathless, his lips whispering promises against my skin. In that moment, nothing else mattered, not Alex, not the consequences, not the world outside. There was only us. But reality has a way of creeping in, no matter how much you try to shut it out. As I lay in Edward's arms later that evening, the weight of what we'd done began to settle over me. The quiet hum of the room felt deafening, each beat of my heart a reminder of the line we'd crossed. "I should go," I said softly, my voice barely above a whisper. Edward tightened his arms around me, his lips brushing my forehead. "I don't want you to." "I don't want to either," I admitted. "But we can't stay in this bubble forever." He nodded, his expression heavy with understanding. "I know. But that doesn't mean I want this to end." The drive home was quiet, my thoughts a tangled mess of guilt, longing, and confusion. When I walked through the door, Alex was sitting on the couch, his laptop balanced on his knees. He looked up and smiled, oblivious to the storm raging inside me. "Hey, you're home late," he said, his tone casual. "Yeah, I got caught up running errands," I lied, my voice steady despite the chaos in my chest. He nodded, already turning his attention back to his screen. I stood there for a moment, watching him, wondering how we'd gotten to this point. How had I become so invisible in my own marriage that he didn't even question my late nights anymore? The days that followed were a blur of routine and tension. Edward and I tried to stay away from each other, but it was impossible. Every glance, every accidental touch felt like a spark, reigniting the fire we were desperately trying to smother. And then everything came crashing down. It was a Saturday afternoon when Alex walked into the living room, his phone in hand. His expression was tight, his knuckles white as he gripped the device. "What's this?" he demanded, his voice sharp as he held up the screen. My heart sank as I saw the message. A text from Edward the first hadn't deleted. It was simple but damning. "I can't stop thinking about you. When can I see you again?" I froze, my mind racing for an explanation, an excuse. Anything that could undo what he'd just seen. But there was no way out. The truth was staring him in the face. "Alex, I can explain," I began, my voice trembling. Explain, he snapped, his eyes blazing with anger and betrayal. Explain how my wife and my father have been sneaking around behind my back. The room seemed to spin as the weight of his words hit me. I tried to speak, to defend myself, but the words wouldn't come. All I could do was stand there, frozen, as the man I once loved looked at me like I was a stranger. How long? He demanded, his voice breaking. How long has this been going on? Tears streamed down my face as I tried to answer, but the words felt hollow, meaningless. Nothing I could say would make it better. Alex threw the phone onto the couch, his chest heaving as he tried to process what he'd just learned. I can't do this, he said finally, his voice cracking. I trusted you. I trusted both of you. And then he was gone, slamming the door behind him as he left me standing there, my world shattered. The house was unbearably quiet after Alex left. I stood frozen in the living room, the weight of what had just happened pressing down on me like a physical force. My mind raced, replaying the look on his face, the shock, the pain, the betrayal. I wanted to chase after him, to beg for forgiveness, but my feet wouldn't move. Deep down, I knew no words could undo what I'd done. Hours passed, but they felt like days. I sat on the edge of the couch, staring at my hands as if they held the answers to the mess I'd created. My phone buzzed on the coffee table, pulling me from my daze. It was Edward. Is everything okay? I'm worried about you. I didn't reply. What could I say? That his son had discovered the affair? That my marriage was hanging by a thread because of what we'd done? The guilt twisted in my chest, suffocating me. I turned the phone over, blocking the screen from view. I couldn't deal with him. Not now, not after everything. The hours stretched into the evening, and eventually, I heard the front door creak open. My heart leapt into my throat as Alex stepped inside, his face a mask of barely contained rage. He didn't look at me as he walked past, heading straight for the bedroom. The sound of drawers opening and closing echoed through the house, followed by the unmistakable scrape of a suitcase being pulled out from under the bed. Alex, I called out, my voice shaky as I followed him. Please, let's talk. He didn't answer, his movements quick and deliberate as he began throwing clothes into the suitcase. I reached out, grabbing his arm to stop him, but he pulled away sharply, his eyes blazing. Talk, he spat. About what? How you've been sneaking around with my father. How you've lied to my face for God knows how long. I'm sorry, I whispered, tears streaming down my face. I never meant for this to happen. Never meant for it to happen? He repeated, laughing bitterly. That's supposed to make it better? Do you even realize what you've done? You've destroyed everything. I couldn't argue with him because he was right. I had destroyed everything. Our marriage, his trust, our life together. And for what? A fleeting connection, a moment of feeling alive. The weight of my choices pressed down on me, and I felt like I was suffocating. Where are you going? I asked, my voice trembling. Away, he said coldly. I need space and I can't be here right now. Not with you. I wanted to beg him to stay, to tell him that we could fix it somehow, but I knew it was futile. The damage was done, and there was no undoing it. I stood in the doorway as he zipped up the suitcase and grabbed his car keys. He paused for a moment, his hand on the doorknob before turning back to me. I don't know if I can ever forgive you, he said quietly. And I don't know if I want to. With that, he was gone, leaving me alone in the empty house that now felt like a stranger's. The silence was deafening, broken only by the sound of my sobs as I sank to the floor. The following days were a blur. Alex didn't come home, and I didn't know where he'd gone. I called his phone, left messages, but he never answered. The guilt and regret consumed me, leaving me unable to eat, sleep, or think clearly. Every corner of the house reminded me of him, of the life we'd built together, and the life I'd so carelessly thrown away. Edward tried to reach out several times, but I ignored his calls and texts. I couldn't face him, couldn't confront the role he'd played in all of this, or my own role for that matter. The connection that had once felt intoxicating now felt like a weight around my neck, dragging me deeper into despair. One afternoon, there was a knock at the door. My heart skipped a beat as I opened it, hoping it was Alex. But it wasn't, it was Edward. He stood there, his expression a mix of concern and regret. I've been trying to reach you, he said softly. I needed to make sure you were okay. I'm not, I said bluntly, stepping aside to let him in. Nothing about this is okay. We sat in the living room, the tension between us thick and suffocating. Edward tried to comfort me, but his presence only made the guilt worse. Every time I looked at him, I saw the destruction we'd caused, the broken trust, the fractured relationships, the pain we'd inflicted on Alex. This was a mistake, I said finally, my voice trembling. All of it, Edward flinched, his jaw tightening as he looked away. You didn't think it was a mistake before. Well, I do now, I snapped, the weight of my emotions finally spilling over. We've ruined everything, Edward. My marriage, your relationship with Alex, it's all gone. And for what? He didn't respond, his silence speaking volumes. For the first time, I saw the cracks in his confidence, the vulnerability he tried so hard to hide. But it wasn't enough. No amount of regret or remorse could undo the damage we'd done. In the weeks that followed, I tried to pick up the pieces of my life, but it felt impossible. Alex filed for separation, and though he didn't say much, the pain in his eyes every time we spoke was unbearable. Edward moved away shortly after, leaving a void that felt both necessary and overwhelming. The connection that had once felt so powerful now felt like a scar, a constant reminder of everything I'd lost. I spent countless nights replaying everything in my mind, wondering how I'd let it get this far. But no matter how much I analyzed it, the answer was always the same. I'd made a choice. And that choice had consequences I would carry with me for the rest of my life. In the months that followed, life moved forward, though it felt like I was stuck in the aftermath of a storm that had left nothing untouched. Alex and I barely spoke, except for the logistical matters of our separation. Each conversation was brief and laced with a quiet pain, as though words alone couldn't convey the depth of what we'd lost. The silence between us was heavy, but I couldn't blame him. It mirrored the emptiness I felt inside. Edward's absence was both a relief and a reminder of everything that had transpired. I heard through mutual acquaintances that he'd left town, retreating to another state to rebuild his own life. I never reached out to him, and he never contacted me again. It was better that way, though I often wondered if he felt the same weight of regret I did, or if he'd managed to move on more easily. In the stillness of my now empty home, I had plenty of time to think, to reflect. I tried to make sense of how I'd ended up here, but the answers were never clear. What I did know was that I'd been searching for something I'd felt I'd lost in my marriage, in myself. Edward hadn't been the solution. He'd been a symptom of a larger problem I hadn't wanted to face. A problem that had been growing for years, unnoticed or ignored. I started therapy a few weeks after Alex moved out. It was a hard decision, but one I knew I needed. The sessions were painful at first, forcing me to confront parts of myself I'd been avoiding for so long. I realized I'd spent years feeling invisible, unnoticed, not just by Alex but by myself. I'd let my identity become so entangled with being a wife, a partner, that I hadn't stopped to ask who I was outside of that. But therapy also taught me that no one else could fill the void inside me. Not Alex, not Edward, not anyone. It was a lesson I'd learned the hard way, through choices that had cost me nearly everything. As I worked through my guilt and shame, I also began to rebuild. Slowly, piece by piece, I started to rediscover myself, the person I'd lost along the way. One of the hardest moments came when Alex and I finalized our divorce. We met at a cafe to sign the last of the papers, and the awkwardness between us was palpable. But before we left, Alex looked at me, his expression softening. "I hope you figure things out," he said quietly. "I really do." "Thank you," I replied, my voice barely above a whisper. "And I hope you find happiness again." It wasn't forgiveness, but it was a start. A small crack of light in the darkness we'd been living in. And though it hurt, I knew it was what we both needed. To let go and move forward, even if that meant walking separate paths. Looking back, I can't say I don't regret what happened. I do. I regret the pain I caused Alex, the betrayal, the destruction of a marriage that might have been salvageable if I'd only had the courage to address our problems instead of seeking validation elsewhere. But I also know that regret alone won't change the past. All I can do now is learn from it, take responsibility for my choices, and try to become a better version of myself. If there's one thing I've learned through all of this, it's that relationships require work, constant, deliberate effort. Love doesn't survive on its own. It needs to be nurtured, cared for. And when cracks start to appear, ignoring them only makes them grow. I see that now, too late to save what I had, but not too late to change how I move forward. As for Edward, I don't know if I'll ever see him again. A part of me will always remember him, not as the man who ruined my life, but as the catalyst that forced me to confront the truth about myself and my marriage. He made me see what I was missing, even if the way it happened was deeply flawed. The road ahead feels uncertain, but I know one thing for sure. I won't make the same mistakes again. Whatever comes next, I'll face it head-on, with honesty and self-awareness. Because in the end, the greatest betrayal wasn't what I did to Alex. It was how I abandoned myself along the way. If you were in her shoes, what would you have done? Could this marriage have been saved, or was the betrayal too much to overcome? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear your perspective. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories that dive deep into the complexities of love, betrayal, and the choices that define us. Stay tuned for the next gripping tale. You won't want to miss it.